Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Josef Joffe, a German journalist and prominent international relations scholar. Most recently, he was foreign and editorial page editor for Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of Europe's most respected newspapers. And he has just been named the publisher designate of the German periodical Die Zeit in Hamburg. Mr. Joffe holds a PhD in government from Harvard, and he's taught at Harvard, Princeton, and most recently at Stanford. He has written numerous scholarly articles and chapters in books, and is a regular contributor to journals like The National Interest, Foreign Affairs, among others. His most recent book is The Future of the Great Powers. Joe, welcome back to Berkeley. Where were you born and educated?
Well, I was born in what is today Lithuania, but I was raised and educated in Cold War Berlin, on the western side, thank God, where I went to elementary school and then to gymnasium, and then my education took a very dramatic turn. I came to the United States as an exchange student, ending up in a place I'd never heard of before, called Grand Rapids, Michigan, and where I was acquainted with the challenge and the pleasures of the suburban American high school.
Mm-hmm. So you were an exchange high school student?
Yes.
Yeah, right, okay.
And so I even have an American high school diploma.
Mm-hmm. And how, let's go back a little before we get you to America. Yeah. How did your parents influence your character, do you think, in retrospect?
Well, I have no other choice but to say that my parents instilled in me a love of learning. This was, after all, the post-war period. This is with millions of people floating around Europe, having lost everything, having just barely saved their lives, their houses, having lost their houses, their families, their property. So I remember two things. One thing was that eat, because those American doctors have told us, if you don't eat, you get tuberculosis. And the second was, so we had this post-war ideal of beauty, which was a bit chubbier than it is today. Mm-hmm. The second thing, of course, I heard relentlessly, was what you have in your head, they can't take away from you. Mm-hmm. So education is everything. So in that respect, my love for food and my love for education these two are probably the most important influences left by my parents, who, by the way, never went beyond 8th grade in their own education.
And do you remember any of the books that you read as a young person?
You mean in terms of
having an influence?
Books?
Yeah, well, any kind. I mean, just before you went to college.
When you're a kid, you read voraciously and without a purpose. And so you read Robert Louis Stevenson and you read Hermann Hesse. You read Greek mythology and Jules Verne. You read a lot of science fiction as a kid, by the way. And you read books which are kind of typical for your teenage life. I would think Hermann Hesse is typical for a certain phase in your life. You gobble them up because they have to do with youth and the confrontation with adulthood and so on, and they're highly idealistic and highly romantic. And you read.
You mentioned Robert Louis Stevenson.
No. That was a kid. No, I was grappling for the name. If you live in Europe or Germany, you read Erich Maria Remarque, who may be known in this country for the famous movie All Quiet on the Western Front. Mm-hmm. And Erich Maria Remarque was this book I just mentioned has to do with World War I, but his main work was about the troubles and toils and travails of World War II. People being uprooted, people trying to escape, people trying to live underground, people living in Paris, refugees not trying to escape the next dragnet of the French police and so on. So I think that was a book. These are books that one would read. And a third author I remember is also not too well known, though. He has his American exile is the Villa Aurora down L.A., and that's Leon Feuchtwanger, who has written a great deal of historical books about the historical roman, which is also something that is typical for those teenage years.
You come to high school in America and you exchange. Tell us a little about that experience.
You asked me about books. My first book that I was confronted with was Moby Dick, which was a grueling but most efficient way of learning English, because you sat there and you had to read what was a complex language to begin with, plus it was replete with nautical terms. And so I had to start reading it, and every page I read, I had about 20 little notations on the margin where I had to look up the word in a dictionary. So if you go through page 300, you know English. You understand English. And that was a very powerful educational experience.
But then you come to America as a high school student and you can apply it. Tell me about that experience.
To apply what?
Your knowledge of English.
Well, this was as I said, Moby Dick was American lit.
Once you were here.
No, here.
Yeah, right.
I was thrust into the American high school by being thrust into an American lit course, and the first book is Moby Dick, and which forced me to learn English, or at least to develop an English vocabulary very quickly. It was grueling, but it was very effective.
And what about interacting with American young people? Was that really quite a different experience for you?
Yeah, obviously. Remember, I came at the end of the 50s, as it were, which was the beginning of the 60s. The 50s were gone, and the 60s weren't quite there yet. The 60s would come with a vengeance, I would say, by the mid-60s, especially with these famous Berkeley events, the free speech movement, Sproul Plaza, and all that. So I came to high school just before that. The 50s were over, the 60s, though in terms of the calendar, had begun, had not really begun. And then it was Western Michigan. It was Calvinist, Dutch Reform country, hardworking, God-fearing people. It was lily white. It was middle class to upper middle class. And it had a lot of wondrous things for a kid coming out of Europe where the post-war period had just ended. So these are really, for me, they were extraordinary. For Americans, they're standard fare. I mean, like eating eggs for breakfast every day, or having meat every day, or taking even a shower every day. I mean, when you come out of a system where central heating and hot water was just slowly being rebuilt after the ravages of the war, you had to heat your own bathwater. These were the wondrous things of American civilization. Culturally, it was not easy, because when you're a big city kid coming from Berlin, as I did, and you come to Western and Western Michigan suburbs, you can imagine how many cultural shocks and clashes there are. I mean, it's the difference between coming from a very large city and going to a fairly small town.
And then you stayed on, and did your undergraduate work in the United States?
Then something even more miraculous happened to me, for reasons too complicated to go into, but there's usually always a woman involved. I applied to Swarthmore College. Now, she didn't get in, I did. She had to go to Oberlin, and I got into Swarthmore. No doubt on my regional German quota. And I must say that I probably went to that place and substitute for Swarthmore, Amherst, Williams, or Wellesley, which must have been the glory days of American liberal education. It was very rigorous, very hardworking. While we were left alone in our social hours, where we could study Marxist study groups where we could go demonstrating, where we could go to the next town and take over City Hall for some civil rights issue and spend the night in jail. We had to be back. No matter, jail was one thing, but we had to be back the next day to be there at our seminar, which ran for 5 hours and which was structured around my paper that week. So I had to get out of jail. I had to finish that paper. And I think we were at that point I was studying political science, philosophy, and economics. I think we were studying at graduate school level, these subjects. I've never been worked so hard in my life. I've never learned so much. And the nice thing compared to today, I would think, is that while we were, by any standard, raging lefties, we had conservative professors who kept us intellectually honest. And that is something which the postmodern, multicultural university of today may no longer do. We did our identity politics, we did outside of college, but in the classroom, it was Leibniz, Descartes, and Kant, and you couldn't handle that with identity politics and facile slogans.
And there you became interested in international politics,
yes.
Or did you bring that too?
Well, obviously, somebody who crosses cultural, geographic, and political borders is almost destined to develop an interest in things international. But I ran into an extraordinary teacher at Swarthmore, which, by the way, as a footnote, also highlights that great moment of American liberal arts education those days. In those days, we had all kinds of nationally renowned professors who stayed in places like Swarthmore. And a decade or two later, they, of course, had all been siphoned off to the great national research universities, and thus it happened with my IR teacher, Kenneth Waltz, who in due time was siphoned off to Berkeley with a stint in Brandeis. Now, Ken Waltz is, by any account, probably the most influential teacher of international relations in this era, in the post-war era, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I was lucky to him as a teacher, and I would assume that encounter shaped, or no, not shaped, it was there before, but furthered, intensified my interest in the subject.
And what is it that you got from Waltz, do you think? Rigor?
Yes. First of all, what I got from him was an appreciation of classical political theory as it relates to the study of something newfangled, if you wish, as international relations. Remember this, the discipline didn't exist before. It was as an academic discipline, it's a post-war phenomenon. And so first of all, here's a man who tells me, yes, Thucydides and Hobbes and Kant are a very important approach to and tool of understanding for what we are talking about today, which is nuclear weapons, bipolarity, the Soviet-American struggle, the Cold War, and so on. Point two was the enormous intellectual rigor that man instilled in us. You could not bullshit your way through with him. You had to cast your arguments in a logical structure that would really hold water and would hold water under high pressure, if you so wish. And the third thing I liked about him was his relentless contrarianism. For him, a cliché was just something to be exploded, meaning whatever received notions and truths that were out there in the academy, they were an incentive to explode. They were an incentive to think even harder and say, is this a cliché? Is this the most interesting cliché we can have? Don't we need new clichés? But they were an invitation to get your brain in motion. That's what I mean by the contrarian spirit. It's an intellectually contrarian spirit. It's the true academic spirit, I would say, to question whatever received wisdom there is.
And you were suggesting a moment ago that your guess would be that things have changed on the American campuses because a contrarian idea may have become an ideology?
No, I mean, I'm not quite sure. Look, there are 3,000 institutions of higher learning or more in America. So and they range from Saddleback College in Los Angeles, from a 2-year community college to Harvard and Berkeley and Stanford. It's very difficult to generalize them. But I would assume that the American university is now going through lots of phases of change, but one of them I think would be the multiculturalism / postmodernism / deconstructivism phase, which I do not believe is very friendly to rigorous thought, because identity politics have very little to do with rigorous thought. And the kind of relentless, almost simple-minded relativism that goes hand in hand with deconstructivism, postmodernism, is also not conducive to rigorous thought, because after all, if everything is a constructed social reality, then there's no truth and there's no falsehoods, then your text is just as good as my literature, just to throw out some of the counter cliches. It cannot be conducive to rigorous thought, because identity politics serves different functions than the search for truth, etc. And the neo-relativism, which is what postmodernism is all about, even denies that there's such thing as the truth. And so I've painted a caricature thereof, but to the extent to which these ways of thinking about knowledge have filtered into the academy, they have driven down the quality and the standards of thinking and achievement.
After Swarthmore, you went on to Harvard, you got a PhD, but you chose journalism over the academy. Why?
Life is full of coincidences. The academy, especially when you leave this wondrous world of undergraduate life, which we all tend to idealize and sentimentalize over for very good reason. It is an extraordinary existence, both socially and intellectually. You become a graduate student, and as we used to say, life of a graduate student is nasty, brutish, but not short. And it lacks all the pleasures that your first 4 years of university have given you. It's a lonely existence, it's an unrewarding existence, it's a narrowing existence. And though there is the pleasure of really pursuing knowledge to depth previously not plumbed, when suddenly this an offer comes along to go into high-class journalism. I mean, not to do the city beat, though that's a very, very important school for journalism, probably the best. But you can sit down and write for a weekly paper. The paper I'm going back to now, Die Zeit, more like essays and features rather than hard news and reportage. That's a very enticing thing. If, as I think of myself, you take a certain pleasure in writing and playing with words and paragraphs. That was part of my genetic makeup, I would think, and so when the opportunity came along, I grabbed it, and I've stayed there ever since, with very important exceptions. I always came back to the academy, and so I've taught at Johns Hopkins, I've taught at Harvard, I've taught at Princeton, now most recently at Stanford. I've taught at the University of Munich, interspersed with my journalistic work. And why? Why would I do that? Because journalism is a dumbing down exercise. You live out of your intellectual suitcases, and or the batteries, they're being slowly run down, and you have to go back to activities where you can read whole books again, rather than the introduction or the book review. So you try to do this by working at home, by doing footnotes in the privacy of your bedroom. But that's not the academic experience, because the academic experience is more than just footnotes. It has to do with interaction, meeting people, talking to people, testing ideas, having them challenge your ideas. And that's why I've always gone back.
And if one reads your journalism, whether in English or German, it is again and again informed by history and theory, which you acquired in your education and in your continuing education.
Right. It makes the journalism better too. And it improves the academic stuff. I mean, I would hope that my academic writing is maybe more legible or readable than classic, straightforward academic writing. And I hope that my journalism is more interesting because it's, as you said, informed by history and theory.
What do you think makes a writer a good writer?
Well, I mentioned it just now in passing. There has to be a certain kind of verbal skill which is part of your genetic makeup. I mean, I'm the kind of guy who scored very high on the verbal SAT, and I scored pretty low on the math SAT. So there must be something, left brain, right brain, whatever it is, over which you have no influence, which is what your parents and grandparents gave you. Verbal intelligence, verbal skills. The second step is you have to take pleasure. You may be verbally skilled, but you may not like it. You still might rather tinker with bicycle chains. So the second condition is taking pleasure in playing with words and crafting words. Third, I think there has to be, how shall we put it, a certain kind of vanity. You have to have you have to be carried forward by your own conviction that you have something to say, that what you have to say should be or maybe is of interest to others. So that call it attention seeking or excessive confidence in yourself or what have you. In addition to the talent and the genes, as it were, the pleasure, there has to be a sense of what you have to say other people might want to read. And so that's a three-step process of becoming a writer.
In your writing, and we should say that your pieces appear in places like the New Republic, the New York Review, and the New York Times Magazine. There's in addition to all that we've talked about, it's characterized by a lucidity and a wit.
Sounds great.
It is.
Yeah.
In fact, I can cite an example from a piece you did on the issue of American power in the world. You are asking your reader to come to terms with America's power. Attractiveness. And you say, are people risking death on the high seas to get into China? How many are willing to go for an MBA at Moscow, and so on? Yeah. Do you do that naturally?
Or dress like the Japanese.
That's right. That's right. So does this come naturally, or is it several drafts, or is it?
No.
Yeah.
I forgot something about when you asked me about what it means to become right. So we had this three-step process: the genetic makeup, the pleasure in words, the urge to trumpet what you have to say. The fourth thing is routine. Routine, and that's true, of course, for any profession, whether you're a plumber or a neurosurgeon. Routine is what helps you to work efficiently and speedily, and gives you confidence that you don't have to sit there and agonize over each sentence. So wit and lucidity, as you so nicely put it, well, if you take pleasure in writing, you want to amuse yourself and you want to amuse your audience. And so you work hard on trying to get your message across lucidly so they can get it without too much effort. And as you so nicely put it, with wit, because that adds an entertaining element to the enterprise, and which will make them even more interested in what you have to say. let's put it in more general terms. I think for whatever reason, and it certainly has to do with an overflow of information, we now have to work harder to attract and hold the interest of our readers. And that invariably means, even when you write for the highest brow magazines and newspapers, that you entertain them. You can no longer take their interests for granted. You must drag them in and keep them bound or spellbound, if you wish.
Is it a struggle to avoid jargon for you because of your training in the social sciences?
Yes.
And what helps you get beyond the jargon?
Well, the jargon, as you know, in any profession is a shorthand. It makes communication between us who are members of the same priesthood much faster. We hit each other with jargon/shorthands. Now, as soon as you start writing for a general audience, you can no longer presuppose the understanding of that jargon, because they are out there, many different priesthoods, many different special audiences. So that, in fact, is one of the largest intellectual efforts in journalism, that you find ways and metaphors to take something like, in a strategic discourse, there's something called a MIRV, which is a multiple independently retargetable vehicle, aka a missile with many warheads that you can send on their different courses. You can't use the word MIRV. You also can't write it up because it takes up 3 lines. So then you have to start racking your brain. How am I going to make this concept clear to the reader? So then you think about Greek mythology, you think about Hydra. Hydra, that monster had many heads. So then you say, oh, it's a Hydra-headed missile. Won't satisfy the tech boys, but the audience will understand, it's something which hasn't just, it's not like a bullet with one warhead, it has many things.
Another component of your work as a journalist, and we'll talk briefly about this and move on to substantive issues, is the interview, basically. I think interviewing must, as I read your work, the people you talk to, especially at the highest policy levels in Germany and the United States. What is essential to doing a good interview?
Well, you're doing it right now.
Okay. So what am I doing?
You know what you're doing? You read this stuff. You know, you've for whatever length of time you've spent it with me, with my writings. You looked into my biography. You looked at my writings, so you get an idea of the person, how that person thinks, and that, of course, gives you a whole plethora of questions to ask. And in a way, by knowing him from his writings, you also know what second and third question to ask after he gives you certain answers. And good interview is a bit like a chess game. You've got to be at least 1 or 2 moves ahead. Then one has to be respectful, as you are, and then you at least have to pretend in a credible way that you're interested in what I have to say. And so there's a slight amount of flattery there, but you're already taken care of by having read the materials, as we would when we interview some politico. We would read his previous utterance and so on. And then you have to be very attentive to nuances, to body language, to eye movement. It's almost an intuitive process. Once you're caught in an interview, where to go next, so you have to have a very nicely calibrated antenna for all kinds of cues which are happening, which are being emitted from the other side. Then you always have, as you do, you have to always nod very assentingly to encourage.
You're going to make me self-conscious, actually.
And to encourage. So he is being rewarded. Your vis-a-vis is being rewarded and encouraged to go on and perhaps divulge more than he originally wanted to.
And then how do you use the interview? Do you then incorporate it into the ideas you already have?
Sometimes we just do we do something that has become rare in the American press. We take the whole interview, qua interview, and print it. If you are a good and fair and benign journalist, what you will do is you'll make your interview sound better than he did. Mm-hmm. So what I do is I edit this stuff and try to figure out what did he really want to say. I'll take a sentence that goes on for 3 minutes without verbs and objects and periods, and try to say, what do you want to say, and this is how I'm going to put it. And if that becomes a very complicated process, I will then consult with that person who said what you wanted to say. Now, if you want to be mean to somebody, you just print them the way they speak.
Let me tell you what my strategy here, as we've talked and taking time into account. I think when you come back in March, we're going to do a second interview if we don't get to all the things that we might discuss about Germany and the United States, which are quite interesting. But now I would like to move into a substantive area and talk a little about today's world. And then from there we can go to talking about the United States' role in the world and Germany's role, which we may or may not get to today. As somebody who does diplomatic history, and which you do quite well in your piece on Germany in the Pastor book, which I guess is called
A Century's Journey. No, my piece. The book is
the book is called Century's Journey.
Mine is the from Frederick to the Federal Republic, the continuity of German foreign policy,
which is a tour de force discussion of modern German diplomatic history, and obviously you theorize about the history. So with that background, and as a journalist, what are the most important features of international politics today? After the end of the Cold War?
The most important feature is the bifurcation or segmentation, if you wish, of the international system. And there's two, here, these are the two segments. I like to call the one segment the Berlin-Berkeley belt, and the other the Belgrade-Baghdad-Beijing belt. The first one is the blessed, pacified, democratic, prosperous, stable, democratic, liberal West, where in many, if not all aspects, certain basic rules of international politics have been unhinged, above all the issue of security, which has driven so much conflict in the past. Security competition, I arm makes you afraid, you counter-arm, etc., etc. So in this blessed plot that extends, from Berlin, or maybe from the Polish border to the Pacific here, where we are sitting, a lot of the old nasty rules have been unhinged, and a lot of good things have happened. Above all, the prediction seems to have come true of the Enlightenment that democracies are not warlike nations. I would put it the other way around. Because we have no war, because the security issue has been solved for us, we have become such nice democracies.
And we should emphasize that what this is in a more traditional view, or in an earlier period, states had to worry about their survival, and they could only really count on themselves.
Right. Self-help system, no authority, no adjudicator above us who can enforce contracts and promises and protect us against our credulity, if you wish. So that's this benign, this blessed spot of the Berlin-Berkeley belt. Then there's the other belt, where which starts 1 hour from Munich by plane. This is Belgrade, where life is as vicious and Hobbesian and competitive and fear and ambition driven as international politics have been throughout the history of the state system. And that extends, of course, via some real pathological areas like the Middle East, where we've had the most dangerous wars in the post-war period. About there were 5 or 6 wars between Israel and the Arabs, plus lots of war between Islamic powers by themselves. So it's not just an Israeli-Arab issue. Then you go into the nuclear competition of Pakistan and India, and you go all the way to Beijing, where you see a classic phenomenon which I would call the rising power phenomenon. First you become rich and then rowdy. First there's affluence, then there's ambition. So following the pattern of the rise of Germany, Japan, and America in the 19th century, here's China at enormous growth rates. And if a strategic threat were to re-emerge, the Berlin, Berkeley, and the Baghdad, Beijing belt would meet there with another contest between the great status quo power in the United States and the rising anti-status quo power, the Chinese.
Now, in this world of two worlds, so to speak, different kinds of power are important.
Right.
And in your writing, a theme emerges, partly first defined by Joe Nye at Harvard, of soft power. Tell us a little about that and how that compares to the traditional power base in the world of insecurity.
I think power has to be seen like a bundle of currencies. Traditionally, the most important currency of power was military power, strategic power. Machiavelli said it's easier to get gold with good soldiers than to get good soldiers with gold. Okay, so on top, the most fungible of all currencies, strategic. Then you can go down to all kinds of economic power, the attraction of your political and social system, even of your movies and your TV, your diplomatic skills, or the power radiating from ideas. I mean, for part of the great power for a while that the Soviet Union had is that this idea of socialism was a very powerful, attractive idea which inspired, the entire third world after decolonization. Everybody went into kind of Marxist Soviet model of economic development, and one party starts and so on. So in the Berlin-Berkeley belt, where the strategic issue for the time being does not arise, then obviously those who have those soft power sources will do very well, such as Germany. Well, I'm hesitating. It used to be Switzerland, but
also the United States.
Yes,
yeah.
But the most important thing is that, see, the best deal you can get is if hard power and soft power comes together. The Vatican has a lot of soft power, but it has no hard power, and so that means the influence of the Vatican is limited. Switzerland has a lot of soft power, but they are nothing in the hard power field. So if you really want to sit pretty today, you have to be like the United States, because the United States has all of these sources in spades. I mean, it's the mightiest military power in the world. It is the mightiest economy. Everybody looks at envy to the way America has restructured its economy beginning in the 1980s. And then, strangely enough, especially for a European to admit this, see, Europeans could always say, America's a daughter of Europe. They may have the brawn, but we have the brain, we have the culture, we have the ruins, we have the old universities, and now America is beating out the Europeans in the cultural field too, and the cultural power I'm talking about covers a whole range. The range is, say, McDonald's to Microsoft, Harvard to Hollywood. It is the great universities in the country, the incredible engines of growth that places like Silicon Valley represent, but also the kind of low-tech, low-taste, if you wish, stuff that everybody seems to love. I mean, like Big Macs and blue jeans and hip-hop and what have you. These things exert an enormous attraction and revulsion, of course. So you have the case of France, where you have 780 McDonald's, and nobody's ever driven people at gunpoint to the Big Mac counter, and yet, if you trash a McDonald's, you become the great cultural hero. So it's both repulsion and attraction. And the question is, what is it that makes America so attractive to the rest of the world at a time when the world no longer depends on America for protection or care packages?
Just to follow up on what you just said, if I can quote Joe Joffe in this New York Times piece, you say, imagine a room full of 14-year-olds from Germany, Japan, Israel, Russia, and Argentina. Obviously, they all would be wearing Levi's and baseball caps, but how would they relate to one another? They would communicate in English, though haltingly and with heavy accents, and about what? The Fugees, Beavis and Butthead, Ace Ventura, Michael Jordan. They would debate the merits of Nike versus Converse, of Chameleon versus Netscape. Sure, they would not discuss Herman Melville or George Gershwin, but neither would they compare notes on Dante or Thomas Mann. The point is that they would talk about icons and images made in the U.S.
You notice that this piece was written a few years ago because nobody talks about Chameleon search engines anymore.
I see.
It's Netscape or
But most of the others still hold.
Yeah.
Most of the others still hold.
Yeah, but I think it's a journalistic observation, but I think it holds true. What this little vignette meant to say is that to the extent that there is a global civilization today, it's a civilization made in USA. And there's probably no antecedent to that. We've had many periods in history where one country or one empire carried its civilization forward, but it was always done by the force of arms. Mm-hmm. So first the Romans conquered the Mediterranean world, then they spread Roman law and Roman philosophy. The French, the creed of the revolution, well, it's transported on the bayonets of the French army. The Soviet Union, a communist empire, if you wish, well, communism really only extended as far as the Red Army could reach. I mean, the real thing. So there's really no example in history where soft power, as it were, by itself, of a certain kind, worked its own way through the system without the force of arm. I can only think of one other example where powerful cultural ideas spread around the world without the force of arm. That was, Jewish monotheism. Then there was no state behind it, taken up by being wrapped up into Hellenic and Roman monotheism. But I guess by that time Christianity was being spread by the force of arms, really by the Roman Empire as long as it persisted.
So how do we account then for the negativism about America that one finds in Europe, even as there is this emulation, which you also find in the United States too?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of answers, but the most important answer is that we often don't like the stuff that seduces us. You see, America, what we mean now, what America stands for, the McDonald to Microsoft syndrome, is enormously seductive. And we don't like what we are being seduced by. So there's always ambivalence, We sometimes hate our girlfriends or our boyfriends or something. That's point one. The other thing is that the seducer is also enormously subversive. Meaning that I once talked to a German upper class person who hated McDonald's. I said, why do you hate McDonald's? And after a while he came up with the real reasons. My kids don't come home for dinner anymore. I said, you hate it because it enlarges your kids' freedom. He says, yes. So that's the subversive part. The kids don't come home for dinner anymore. They no longer depend on their parents. So America is a steamroller of modernity, which, like any steamroller, flattens not only old habits, but old power and status structures. And that, as you know, is a counter-revolutionary situation. We don't like to lose our power and status to the new thing, to coin a phrase. So that too explains the enormous, the resistance. The third factor, I would say, is that take France, which is the best example of anti-Americanism, because it comes out of France in its purest form. Well, France is a country that first lost its strategic superiority in Europe to those upstart Prussian Germans, and they kept being clobbered by them until they lost their empire too. And then they lost their cultural superiority, which lived way beyond French strategic superiority, way beyond, into the 20th century. And they lose it to this upstart, the United States, to which, de Gaulle always used to refer to as our niece or something, or offspring. That's a lot to sustain, and so this is the third reason. It's the resentment of coming out as the loser first on the strategic front and then on the cultural front.
Do you think that as a writer, a journalist, and a commentator, you were sensitized to these issues early in this experience of wonder that you were described when you were a high school student coming to America and seeing all this American wondrous things in comparison to the situation in post-war Germany?
Well, I would slightly enlarge the point. It takes the transgression of cultural borders to be aware of contrasts and similarities. From your very own culture, you can't see very far, and what you see is you will always perceive in terms of your own frame of reference. And so if you're a Frenchman and you've learned that Racine and Flaubert were the pinnacle of literature, then you will be tempted to say that Emerson and Walt Whitman and Faulkner are less significant examples of this species. But once you transcend, say, the French language, you begin to learn English, you begin to learn American English literature, you begin to live in English or American universities, then you begin to look at the same thing from a second or even tertiary vantage point. And so I'm a great fan of people living in more than one culture and learning more than one language, which is happening anyway. I think English, the American accented version, is becoming the global language, and everybody now wants his kids to at least spend some time in American or English school or university, so you can acquire that second mother tongue, quote unquote.
To what extent is this power that America has, power in the traditional sense, so therefore that all of these global forms of culture are really manifestations of American power, and to what extent is it something else, as you're just sort of saying, a new global language?
Well, it's a little bit to what extent does Microsoft have power? I think most people I know hate Microsoft, they hate Windows, but they can't do without it. So power is when you can define the rules and the standards. Now, America tends to define more and more rules and more standards. That's a kind of power. It's very different from the power that you have when you conquer another country and you erect an empire over it. It's at best informal and a very diffuse power, and it comes with resentment. But I think if you look at it from an American point of view, in terms of the American interest, it does serve American interests, because to the extent to which America produces things and ideas that other people want and find attractive, it will, the attraction will always exceed the revulsion or repellence. So in that respect, it is like traditional power. It kind of gives you a kind of net surplus in your power balance. After you subtract from the attraction, you subtract the resentments. you still have a positive balance left over in the account.
So our plan, let me ask you one more question, and then our plan is that you'll come back in March and we'll talk about Germany and U.S. policy. We didn't have time in this. What lessons would you think students might draw from your story, so to speak, about how they might prepare for the future
Well,
in terms of things to study and so on. You've suggested some of them just now.
Well, I'm a great believer in liberal arts, as I imbibed them in the mid-'60s and beyond. And now we are sitting here in the heart, on the periphery here in Silicon Valley. I'm sitting right now in the heart of Silicon Valley.
As a visiting scholar, visiting lecturer at Stanford.
Which is at Stanford. Now, I'm extremely impressed, as everybody else is, from the Wall Street Journal to the general interest magazines, about the explosion of this and that, e-commerce, e-blah, and the new thing and the next big thing and so on. But precisely because the new thing is coming in at ever shorter intervals, I've even become more of a believer in liberal arts education. There's more to life than electrical engineering, especially since the skills you acquire in electrical engineering at Stanford today will be obsolete in about 4 years, even less. What is liberal arts all about? Liberal arts gives you an education. What is an education? Well, apart from the pleasures of knowing Shakespeare and Flaubert and Turgenev and Goethe, it teaches you how to learn. It gives you a sense of how little you know, and it endows you with tools by which you can acquire and process more knowledge. In addition to making you a more interesting human being, if you can talk about more than E-Trade and megabits. So, in short, a liberal education has become more critical today than ever.
And it also, just one last thing, it teaches you to look for the continuities in history, too, which is something you suggested when you were talking about Swarthmore.
Well, it makes you somewhat more humble about your own time when you realize that somebody like the great Greek chronicler Thucydides had written 2,500 years ago, had written a book called The Peloponnesian War, which has contributed more to my understanding of the Cold War, when again two great powers like Sparta and Athens were tangling with each other, than so many contemporary literature on the Cold War. Continuity makes you more humble. It also makes you makes you wiser, because, as you know, the new thing may not be quite as new thing, and others have thought these ideas, and I find this a very interesting multicultural experience in a very funny way. It just tells me, I'm part of that large family that reaches back 2,000-3,000 years, who have thought things that I'm thinking today and who've taught me how to think these things. And isn't that a wonderful multicultural experience in the best sense of the term?
Joe, thank you very much for joining us and talking about your life, and we'll look forward to having you back in a month to talk about Germany and the United States and their foreign policies. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.